Welcome to this lecture on Nietzsche, amor fati, nihilism, the end of history, and the Übermensch. Before I begin, though, I wanted to point out that if you'd like to take private philosophy tutorials with me, just reach out to me and we can find a date and time where we can discuss philosophy further. I also have a Patreon account where you can support my work. And feel free to subscribe to my channel and also leave a comment in the comment section down below. Thank you very much. Enjoy the lecture. Nietzsche knew that his thought was meant to be a bridge towards new dawns, that his was a thinking that had to suffer through a desolate age, which ultimately led to his own collapse. A widespread misunderstanding of Nietzsche stems from his remark in the Twilight of the Idols, the Göttendämmerung, where he states that he wants to philosophize with a hammer, but notes that he does not say that he wants to destroy everything that has been. Rather, he wishes to show us that ideals and values we still live by have voided themselves of meaning, that what is being heralded as meaningful is empty, that even the highest values have become meaningless. And shall I point out, this is how you get to all the bullshit today. The hammer Nietzsche uses then is not a tool of destruction. Nietzsche always warns of those who are great destroyers, those who bear and bring the desert. But the hammer is rather a tuning fork that Nietzsche applies to the shallow ideals and idols of his and our epoch, and that means to the guiding values we live by in order to reveal their hollow sound, their hollowness. Perhaps if we gain an understanding, rather if we attune our ears to what Hölderlin called holy pathos and Shannonian sobriety, then we might be able to hear the nearly silent notes in Nietzsche, which is where his thought really takes place. After all, Nietzsche's Zarathustra says, and I quote, "It is the stillest words that bring on the storm, thoughts that come on dove's feet, guide the world." In the first section of the third essay of the Generality of Morality, Nietzsche writes the following about the ascetic ideal, quote, "That the ascetic ideal has meant so much to man reveals a basic fact of human will, its horror vacui. It needs an aim, the will needs an aim, and the will prefers to will nothingness rather than not will." Horror vacui means the horror of emptiness. Now, in Beyond Good and Evil, an essay written around the same time as the genealogy, Nietzsche has the following to say about the will, and I quote, "Therefore, just as feelings are to be recognized as ingredients of the will, so in the second place, thinking is also to be recognized. In every act of the will, there is a ruling thought, and let us not imagine it possible to separate this thought from the willing, as if the will would then remain over." What is the ruling thought of our willing today? Nietzsche is the thinker of modernity who recognizes that the will, which prominently figures in Spinoza, Leibniz, Fichte, Schelling, Schopenhauer, and Hegel, and Kant, of course, who Hegel even argued that knowledge is will and vice versa. Nietzsche sees that this will is a will to power, and that means the will always goes beyond itself and wants and wills more for the sake of willing more. Schelling determines Ursein, original being, as will. Fichte rationalizes the acts of the will in terms of the will itself, of which we can only say, as Fichte does, "It is as it is because it is so." This is a quote from Friedrich Beiser. Let's be clear what this means. The causa sui, that means the being of beings in this epoch, the way that metaphysics determines being in this epoch, is the will that wills itself. The causa sui is what causes itself, and with the will that wills itself, why? Because it wills itself, metaphysics has finally given itself its ultimate response. Now, this is why the will comes up with all modern philosophers. They have to respond to the will, and this is also why the so-called free will debate is not and will not be resolvable. In fact, this debate leads us astray from a genuine axis to what is taking place in this epoch. What the human will fears the most is not to have an aim. This is our horror vacui, our horror of emptiness. Rather than not willing at all, the will rather wants nothingness. The spreading of nothingness, put differently, the will wants nihilism rather than not having an aim. Why? For the will always needs to increase its power and go beyond itself. Yet, if there is nothing there to latch onto, the will begins to turn against itself and becomes utterly destructive. Immanuel Kant, in his Anthropology, argues that boredom, which Kant calls horror vacui, interestingly, boredom for Kant is disgust with oneself. Boredom is the horror vacui of a will that no longer feels and that no longer experiences any sensations, that's no longer affected by anything. Hence, the will constantly needs to be affected, else the will falls prey to its most profound fear, emptiness and boredom. This leads to an increase in nervous reaction rather than genuine spontaneous action. Nietzsche, towards the end of the 19th century, sees that there is no aim left, that our epoch lacks a profound reason for its existence, that the promises of the future to come have already been voided. But most importantly, and the origin of all of that aimlessness, is the death of God. For Nietzsche, this is not simply the fin de siècle mood, the end of the century mood. There has rather occurred a profound tectonic shift in history, and this shift will be our history for the next 200 years. This history is what Nietzsche calls nihilism. In a posthumously published note from 1887, Nietzsche writes, and I translate from the German, "Nihilism, the aim is missing. The answer or response to the why is lacking. What does nihilism mean? That the highest values are devalued." End of quote. If the will needs constant affection and stimulation, as Kant says, then our economies of desires, which are indefinitely scalable precisely because the will always wants more power and always wants to overpower itself, then those global economies work precisely according to that strange law where the meaninglessness and continued devoiding of meaning of our epoch is what the will wants and needs in order to reproduce, and that is to keep the engine of the wheelwork running, a wheelwork that circles around itself aimlessly. The human will, though, needs an aim. Yet in nihilism, the overall aim is missing. Finding or making one's own meaning for oneself is not enough. As Kierkegaard realized long before Nietzsche, even the subject is incapable of finding or even creating proper meaning that sustains existence in a profound manner. What is subjectively regarded as meaningful today can be thrown out the window tomorrow. It may well be that this is precisely how capitalist meaning and trend production functions. Is there not an emptiness about the things in our daily life, void yawning at us from the disposable things we are surrounded with? We inhabit unworlded worlds, as it were. The strange, perhaps uncanny, unhomely thought arises that this willing of nothingness is precisely the meaning or sense of this age. What is it that Nietzsche means by nihilism? The word nihilism comes from the Latin word for nothingness, nihil. To say that sense or meaning are lacking is not, however, a proper way of thinking after sense and meaning. Meaning is not something that is simply given or available, like a table or a chair or this room or this microphone I'm talking at the moment. Meaning is something else entirely. Meaning is that which, or that thanks to which, all that is appears in the way it appears to us. Thus, if our epoch is an epoch of meaninglessness, of nihilism, then that does not mean a lack of some concrete thing called meaning that should be there, available for our operations, but that the way in which the world appears is empty, devoid of a higher historical goal beyond consumerist promises and effective distractions, engineered both to excite and calm the will simultaneously. Things are not unique in our age, but perfectly replaceable, produced, in fact, as artifices that are not to have a unique being, but only serve to fill in for something else as soon as something else has been consumed. This management of things is sustainable in the true sense of the word. That is to say, everything is sustained by the sheer fact that everything is circularly replaceable. The constant talk of something being new and improved serves but to cover up the non-uniqueness of things that no longer invite us to stay with them or be gathered by them. The word thing originally meant gathering. Things, and the German language also knows the word Unding, thing, now only demand us to consume, and to consume for the sake of consuming more. The thirst for authenticity and the real and the genuine are symptoms of this too. It's a strange age when you come to think of it, where food has to be called real food. Was food ever not real? Note also the strange phenomena of what Nietzsche calls the historical sense, which is a rather recent development, he notes. The fact that we categorize in an accelerating manner even our own micro-epochs which we are living through, as if we are actually living through abstract historiographical categorizations that are somewhat separate from us, such as postmodernity, postmodernity even, or hypermodernity, or even post-truth, and the last one perhaps most strongly indicates the loss in meaning. And while we are living through these, we at once seem to be abandoning a genuine sense of the past, and as imagined eschatological futures collapse. What this indicates to me, this development, is that making sense of the world is increasingly abstract and abstracted, itself in hyper mode, precisely because of an acceleration of the loss of meaning in our sorry attempt at trying to make sense of what is going on. At the same time, there is also a longing for eternity. Just think of the promises of digital immortality and the promise or threat of automation, i.e. of a perfectly sustainable cybernetic circuit circling only around itself for eternity. The nihilism we live through is a rather weird meaninglessness then when we come to think of it. Meaninglessness can only reign where there is, or rather where there has been meaning. The strangeness of this epoch then is the uncanny sense of senselessness. More precisely, that the sense of our epoch is senselessness, that the meaning of our age is meaninglessness. It is an epoch where all values are voided. Hence, Nietzsche advocates for the transvaluation of all values, for going beyond even good and evil, for the moral hypothesis has lost its foundation with the death of God. Note then that, as Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil, that there is always also a thought or a certain way of thinking that guides the will. Willing cannot be separated from thinking, Nietzsche says. What way of thinking guides the will to nothingness? A thinking that has realized that the previous attempts at formulating meaning have collapsed or are collapsing. The reactions to that range from full embrace of nihilism in the form of a thirst for annihilation, or the talk of humans as the sole creators of the atomistic meanings of their existence. And of course, hedonism is part of that too, or just a blind consumerism. Thus, Nietzsche writes in another unpublished note that a, quote, new what for, ein neues wozu, is what humanity needs. This what for is for Nietzsche a value, a highest value, in fact, that could serve as a guide for humanity. For Nietzsche, it is upon strong, unique individuals to make history by setting the highest values. What has been the history so far, and what were the highest values? Platonism and Christianity, and to a certain degree, these two, even though they were nihilistic, they were also bulwarks against nihilism. They were nihilistic, however, for Nietzsche insofar as they both have a tendency to deny life, and that is, they deny the absolute necessity of irresolvable contradictions and opposites by establishing another world, the world of ideas and ideals, which is supposed to be the true world for its claim to eternity, to being as something permanently present. Thereby, both effectively cancel out what makes life what it is. They tend to deny the bodily and ecstasy of life, while they also promise salvation. Nietzsche identifies a certain contempt for this worldly world in them. Wanting to go beyond, longing for the other world of perfection is for Nietzsche tantamount to a denial of life, and that is to the contradictions inherent in life. Note, however, that Nietzsche does not detest Christ. The Übermensch for Nietzsche is Caesar with the soul of Christ. And that means the Übermensch is someone who can lead and rule, who is creative in the true sense of creare. The Übermensch is the highest type of man, and at the same time the Übermensch is a master of his benevolence and goodwill. The Übermensch in that sense is also someone who can love what is necessary, and that means to love the inherent contradictions of existence, not just to rule over them, but to let them flourish in their own right. This is why Zarathustra in the prologue proclaims, quote, I say to you, one must still have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star. This does not mean that chaos shall reign on its own. Chaos could not reign on its own. But that chaos, which means abyss, is allowed its course together with reason and order. This is what Nietzsche calls the grand style. Zarathustra thus also says the following, which is of tremendous historical significance for us now. Quote, not only the rationality, Vernunft, or reason of millennia, also their madness breaks out in us. Dangerous is it to be an heir. We are the heirs of the reason and unreason of millennia, what one may call acceleration, post-truth, nihilism, is this very sudden outburst and outbreak of the historical in our epoch, which seems to have transparent insight into and access to all epochs of the past and of the present on all imaginable levels. How is it, just as a question, that we do have access to everything of the past? The collapse of meaning, which is our epoch, is the collapse of Platonism and Christianity. The death of God was felt already by Hölderlin. For Hölderlin, modernity is the absence of the divine. In the second composition of his Empedocles, Hölderlin writes, quote, to be alone and without gods is death. In his book Contributions to Philosophy, Heidegger responds to Hölderlin by saying, quote, the most frightful tribulation must be the dying of a god. We today are hearing the echoes of that frightful tribulation. There is nothing triumphant about the death of God. In a passage simply entitled Hölderlin, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche in the same book, Heidegger portends that all three of them, quote, had to come to an untimely end because they all suffered in their respective way the upheaval of the world. What is being prepared? Heidegger asks. And he emphasizes that we must begin to build new worlds to be part of new dawns. But with Nietzsche, one has to accept nihilism first. In 1885, Nietzsche notes down, "Nihilism is at the door. Whence does it come, this most uncanny, most unhomely, unheimlichster guest of all?" This guest comes to us from the breakdown of ultimate meaning, the breakdown of the true world, a realm that perhaps is now erected with the digital cloud, an ephemeral system that seems to be forever, for it has technologically instantiated the Nunc stans, the standing now, which is a coldly glowing standing now, timeless time, and still infinitely modulatable. There is a sense of timelessness of the digital and the virtual, which is why we use it to kill time, our horror vacui, our boredom. What does Nietzsche see in the death of God? A triumph, or rather a tragedy not to be resolved but to be affirmed? It is worth reading Nietzsche's The Madman in full from paragraph 125 in The Gay Science. "Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, 'I seek God, I seek God'? As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. 'Has he got lost?' asked one. 'Did he lose his way like a child?' asked another. 'Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated?' Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. 'Whither is God?' he cried. 'I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers.' 'But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed. And whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto." Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. "I have come too early," he said then. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not reached the ears of men." This is not a triumphant subject. This is not a perverted version of the Übermensch as Superman proclaiming himself God and all-powerful over his fate. This is the insight into how history moves in concealments, nearly silently, that history is echoes that we respond to, even if we fail to respond properly, as do the self-styled atheists in the passage who only do as much as shrug. The horizon, the ultimate boundary and limitation that gave us meaning and direction, has been swept away. The closed cosmos, the continuum of existence, has given away to the infinitely expanding space. The imagined expansion of space is but one indication of the accelerating explosion that is modernity. Everything is expanding without boundary, without limitation, and seemingly without any other reason than to expand and explode further and further. Is not limitation the greatest fear of modern man? Does not modernity take off precisely when the telos, the final cause and limit of a thing, is removed by Descartes and Francis Bacon and others? Even though Nietzsche sees the death of God and modern man's murder of him at the heart of the problem of the chaos that is unfolding as modernity accelerates, there is not only no return, for that would be weak nihilism. Rather, the response must be a strong nihilism for now, and that means a full acceptance of nihilism as the meaning of our epoch, and only then can there be an opening in history. Nietzsche writes in the Nachlass, in the unpublished notebooks, quote, starting point. It is a mistake to regard social crises or physiological degeneration or even corruption as causes of nihilism. Rather, nihilism is grounded on a very specific interpretation. The Christian moral interpretation, to be precise, psychological, physical, intellectual hardship is by itself totally incapable of producing nihilism, and that means the radical rejection of value and meaning. That's what nihilism is for Nietzsche. The moral hypothesis had the advantage, Nietzsche stresses, to have been, quote, the great antidote against practical and theoretical nihilism, Christianity and Platonism. But this antidote has exhausted itself. Sticking to it, to that moral way of thinking, turns morality into hyper-morality, as we see now. And it also includes the belief in another world, and that means in a perfect world that might even come. And it denies, though, the impact of the death of God. And it denies the absence of the divine. And it's a form of weak nihilism, and it's extremely destructive, according to Nietzsche. What is needed, however, now is a strong nihilism, and that accepts the future. He writes accordingly in a note from 1887, I am telling the story of the next 2 centuries. I am describing what cannot come about any different anymore. The rise of nihilism. Nietzsche calls the condition of our time, quote, incomplete nihilism and its forms. We are living right in the middle of it. End of quote. Without transvaluing overcome collapsed values, chaos intensifies. Hence, what is necessary is a new kind of man, a different type, someone who can accept and affirm nihilism. More to the point, someone who can again accept the tragedy at the heart of existence, contradictions without sublation, loss without consolation. But who is truly thriving in the world as it is now, in this unworlded world. For Nietzsche, it is not the Übermensch, but it is clearly the letzte Mensch, the last man, and not really a higher type. In the prologue to Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, Behold, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asks the last man, and blinks. The earth has become small, and on it hops the last man, who makes everything small. His race is as ineradicable as the flea. The last man lives longest. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth. One still loves one's neighbor and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. One still works, for work is a form of entertainment. But one is careful lest the entertainment be too harrowing. One no longer becomes poor or rich, both require too much exertion. Who still wants to rule, who obey, both require too much exertion. The last man clings to the moral hypothesis, fools himself to be on the right side of history, a history whose meaning he is, after all, having attempted to end history once and for all, and all of meaning with it. And perhaps most importantly, the last man is the ideal consumer, craving product after product to fill the vacuum while he blinks at the latest gadget. The last man denies the reality of that history. Perhaps this is why Francis Fukuyama titled his pamphlet For the Demanded End of History and the Claim to Neoliberal Market Democracy as the absolute meaning of that finalized or demised history, the end of history and the last man. That's the title of his book. I wonder why. The last man as the meaning of the history. Is this what Fukuyama and others want? A docile, surveilled, controlled, barely even reactive herd that asks no questions, no question beyond itself at least. The meaning of all of history in an absolute sense then would have been truly nihilistic if this were its end. Hence there needs to be someone willing to suffer through the current nihilism while aiming to go over and beyond it. This someone is who Nietzsche calls the Übermensch, the one who goes beyond. Yet nihilism must first be affirmed as the meaning of the current epoch. Nietzsche writes in the Nachlass, quote, "What is necessary is a counter-movement, which at some point in the future will supersede that total nihilism. This counter-movement, however, presupposes nihilism logically and psychologically. It simply can arise only after and out of from nihilism. Why is the rise of nihilism necessary? Because our previous Platonic Christian values themselves demand it as their last consequence. Because nihilism is the thought through to the end logic of our great values and ideals. Because we first have to experience nihilism to discover what the value behind these values was. What Nietzsche means here is that the last consequence of these values, not necessarily the values per se, is that the denial of contradiction and opposition takes the upper hand. Note also that this clearly indicates how history works and that thinking has consequences, unintended consequences. Our attempts at total control of nature, our denial of suffering as inextricably part of existence are just two consequences. Put differently, the Dionysian element is denied its course. What Nietzsche means by suffering is something quite specific, however. Suffering means that we are creatures and creators at the same time, and that means that we don't make ourselves, we suffer, Leiden, existence itself, and the inevitability of finitude. An age without suffering wants to deny existence itself. Hence the self-styled optimism of our time, which denies the negativity of being, is in fact a poorly disguised pessimism and resentment towards life. This is what we can see with Nietzsche. Only by affirming nihilism as the necessary foundation for this epoch, by striding through nihilism and welcoming tragedy again, can there be an opening again in history, rather than the endless henceforth doom loop promised by the ghost of the end of history. Others have named this the positive feedback loop of capital. Nietzsche himself indicates what the end of history might look like. It has very much to do with economics, as does Fukuyama's dark vision for us. Again, one needs to wonder why Fukuyama wants this supposed last epoch of all epochs to be the epoch of the last man. For Nietzsche, this would mean, as he writes in a note from autumn 1887, quote, adaptation, the flattening, the satisfaction in the shrinking of man, a kind of standstill, Stillstand, in the niveau or level of man. What would this lead to? Not too far from what Fukuyama and others have proclaimed, and not too far from the demon that has been named neoliberalism or economic optimism. Nietzsche here continues, and I quote, and I should point out that this translation is from Ivo de Gennaro. Quote from Nietzsche, once we have that total overall economic management of the earth, which is inevitably in store, humanity can find its best sense as a machinery at the service of this management, as an uncanny, again unheimlich, unhomely wheelwork of ever smaller, ever more finely adapted wheels, as an ever-growing, becoming superfluous of all dominating and commanding elements, as a whole of enormous strength, whose single factors represent minimal forces, minimal values. As one can see, what I fight is economic optimism. As if the fact that everybody's expenses rise necessarily implied that everybody's benefits rise as well. It seems to me that the opposite is true. The expenses of all sum up to an overall loss. Man becomes less. So that one does not know anymore what this enormous process was good for. A what for. A new what for. This is what humanity needs. And this is not a moralizing claim, though, by Nietzsche. Nietzsche does not feel sorry for the wheels and cogs, i.e. for those who, following their herd mentality, neatly adapt to this uncanny wheelwork. Instead, Nietzsche describes the future of the world, which is inevitably coming. Most important to grasp, however, then, is that this uncanny wheelwork is our epoch's response to nihilism, to the death of God, to the lack or sense of sense and direction, and to the continued collapses of all momentary meanings that we're giving our lives when they collapse the moment we've given them to ourselves. The wheelwork that is being set up, a positive feedback loop, cancelling out all negativity, a wheelwork where everyone finds their place as an ever more finely adapted and tuned wheel, in a wheelwork that aimlessly turns around itself, which can maintain its power only by proclaiming the new and the improved, every day anew, which must necessarily accelerate lest someone begins to wonder, what is all this for? The wheelwork attempts to give us meaning by cancelling out negativity. Yet it is a nihilistic response to nihilism, and a weak nihilistic response at that at once tries to deny nihilism. But if one denies negativity, negativity catches up with you immediately. The reduction of man, which is a result of that denial, is what Nietzsche fears the most. This would come about precisely when there is no transcendent historical meaning. Comfort leads to a reduction of man, the comfort one may take in the fact, i.e. the sheer unquestioned givenness that history has ended. This, in turn, leads to the will to abolish suffering. There is here no higher aim, no what for. There is just a slow demise, and the ignorance towards suffering and tragedy as truth of existence will make the human being long for extinction and decline, as Nietzsche warns in paragraph 225 of Beyond Good and Evil. To make this clear again, our economic system, and on the level of Nietzsche there is no difference between capitalism and socialism, is a response to nihilism that does not accept and affirm nihilism and thereby tries to get over nihilism. Instead, this wheelwork is a reinforcement of weak nihilism and actually needs nihilism, you could say. On modern adaptation, Nietzsche writes somewhere else in the Nachlass, quote, "Man unlearns how to act. He merely reacts to stimuli from without. This leads to, quote, a deep weakening of spontaneity. And that means freedom. What are we today? Nietzsche calls us, quote, historians, critics, analysts, interpreters, spectators, collectors, readers. They are all reactive talents, all of science. It is an artificial trimming of one's nature to an image. We are all very interested, but at all times merely epidermally interested. There is a fundamental coldness about modern man." And Nietzsche ends this quote then as follows: "Contrast of the external mobility, flexibility, to a certain deep heaviness and tiredness on the inside. We remain busy so as not to face up to the horror vacui looming within us. The voiding of meaning is numbed. and covered over by an acceleration of the spectacle and our reactions to it, and hence you get to the sick phenomena of binge watching, etc. There's another wonderful quote by Nietzsche that we need to take into consideration to understand our epoch. He writes in The Twilight of the Idols, "And everywhere an obscene haste rules, as if one would miss out on something if by the age of 23 a young man is not yet ready or finished, if he does not know yet the answer to today's main question, which career? Higher men, if I may say so, have time. They take their time. They don't even dream of being ready. At the age of 30, one is a beginner, a child in high culture." Nietzsche here continues with an anecdote which is quite prescient for us today about the educational system. It's a short dialogue. "What is the task of all higher education? To turn man into a machine. What are the means to achieve that? Man needs to learn how to be bored. How do you achieve that? With duty." Boredom, in the peculiar modern sense of not being productive, is not the enemy of the uncanny wheelwork. Rather, our economy of desires is an economy of managed boredom. Someone who gets bored can best be taken hostage by the feverish desires the spectacle awakens. Distraction is a good business model. It is a vice for modern man. Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science to be idle. We rather want breathless haste in working. The threat is that life will be covered with a most odd mindlessness, to quote from Nietzsche, and he says also, "Already one is ashamed of keeping still. Long reflection almost gives people a bad conscience," end of quote. "The new attitude forbids one to rest," and I quote again from Nietzsche, "Rather do anything than nothing. Even this principle is a cord to strangle all Bildung, education, and all higher taste." Nietzsche also stresses that in such a society, quote, "one no longer has time and energy for ceremony, for civility with detours, for esprit in conversation, and in general for any otium. Today we are increasingly suspicious of all joy." Again, the reason for this is the collapse of meaning, the death of the Christian God, for we have to numb ourselves just so we not face the horror of emptiness. Rather do anything, even willing annihilation or the desertification of the world, than let the nothing be, than let the nothing take its course in its own right. For nihilism is our history, as Nietzsche says. Hence, for there to come about a new grand what for, we need to let nihilism reign, but in such a way that nihilism is at once affirmed and turned around, overturned from within itself. Nietzsche then consequently does not give us a concrete new what for. The Übermensch is not the meaning of history. His thought, Nietzsche's thought, is rather directed at the possibility of new dawns, as an apocalypse in the sense of an opening in history reserved for the few and rare to bring about. The formula amor fati and the eternal recurrence of the same are not answers to the questions of nihilism, but pathways through it. Amor fati is neither self-help to achieve inner peace nor self-aggrandizement. The amor fati is historically necessitated consequence articulated by a thinker who suffered through the death of God and the disappearance of meaning before most awoke to it. Moreover, amor fati cannot be divided from the thought of the eternal recurrence, which speaks to the truth of time itself in the way that metaphysics can do. The third response for Nietzsche's path through nihilism is the dictum incipit tragedia, may tragedy begin. These three together are necessarily conjoined as pathmarks through nihilism. This is how we need to understand Nietzsche's formulation of the amor fati in his late essay Ecce Homo. There he writes, quote, My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it. So you see, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, speaks to the movements of time and to eternity itself and how eternity recurs. So this is not a claim that is to help with personal problems that we may face. This is not a claim by Nietzsche about himself and his presumed cleverness. Instead, Nietzsche sees this formula as absolutely necessary for the given historical crossroads. What is meant by amor fati? The love of what is necessary is how we could translate this formula. What is necessary? For Nietzsche, this means not to deny that which has been and that which is to come, not to become a critical historian, as he puts it in the use and abuse of history for life. Rather, one is to become a monumental thinker, someone who can profoundly understand the meaning of the past and project futures from that which has been. Whoever says amor fati does not merely accept the social conventions of the day as a Stoic would do. The formula amor fati is not withdrawal, but it's affirmation of suffering, and that is supposed to lead to action. While Stoicism means a denial of the will, and in fact also of the world to a certain degree, there is truly a sense of fatalism, which is not present in Nietzsche. For the Stoic, freedom is only internal, as Mark Aurelius argues. The soul cannot be touched by what happens externally to the soul. For Nietzsche, however, it is all about acting, not about remaining untouched by external circumstances. The ultimate Stoic, therefore, was a slave called Epictetus. Perhaps Stoicism, in one form or another, tends to occur during times of collapse, when all is lost. At least one's inner self is supposed to remain free and at peace. But being at peace with oneself is precisely the opposite of what Nietzsche wants. He wants those who can bear even chaos within themselves, who appreciate the Dionysian as fundamental to their existence. Hence, the notion of fatum in Nietzsche means something else than simply fates or external or social conventions. Fatum here does not mean simply to accept fate as something given. Instead, Nietzsche in the German speaks of the Notwendige, that which is necessary, that which necessarily is as that which has been and that which will be from out of that which has been. This is to be affirmed and loved. That means what is to be affirmed is time itself and its ecstatic movements, is deep history, is the occurrence of the possibility of meaning. For meaning is never simply given, but must always be wrested from the dimensions of concealment and absconding. Hence, Nietzsche's formula of amor fati is not Panglossian either. Dr. Pangloss, the Leibnizian optimist of Voltaire's Candide, rationalizes any and all terrible events that occur. The slaughter and death of tens of thousands is accepted and celebrated. For this world is, to quote Leibniz and Pangloss, the best of all possible worlds. This is Leibniz's moral solution to the problem of evil. God is perfect. Hence, everything he creates is perfect. Hence, this is the best of all possible worlds. And that means there is no evil. Pangloss is the extreme version of that formula. Yet Nietzsche is not a moral thinker, but a thinker of history and meaning, and the amor fati is not Panglossian, since it is not meant to rationalize existence as wonderful and all leading to the best outcome anyways, as if existence were some calculation. Thus, what is affirmed by Nietzsche is all that has been so far, insofar as it was an attempt to ward off nihilism. Nietzsche also consequently affirms all that currently is and that means the dying of God, and the uncanny real work is our response to nihilism, precisely because only if these are not just indifferently accepted or opposed, but only if these are affirmed, can there be a turning, i.e., can we find new openings in history. By affirming something, one weakens what one is confronted with. By opposing what one is confronted with, one's identity becomes negative. And that means one needs what one is opposed to as a necessary condition for one's existence. Hence, in the same chapter of Ecce Homo, Nietzsche speaks of idealism as a disease, but as a necessary sickness, necessary to arrive at reason. To make this point clearer, for Nietzsche, idealism is the assumption of another world, of the true supersensual world, as opposed to the ephemeral world, which is transient to this worldly world, and therefore not the true world, according to this version of Platonism. Now, the sickness of idealism lies in the fact, as Nietzsche would have it, the inherent denial of this world. Yet to arrive fully at that which is, one needs to suffer, one needs to stride through sickness. On another level, Nietzsche here says that idealism, Platonism, the Christian God, etc. were absolutely necessary precisely because they show a great will to power, and that means to a creation of the world, and hence they are, even if not in a full sense, still to a certain degree a yes to life. Philosophy, Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, is always a spiritual will to power, and that means a will for the creation of the world, to build worlds. I have already hinted at the connection of amor fati and the eternal recurrence of the same. The eternal recurrence is Nietzsche's formula for the workings of time. That which currently is will recur. The German verb here is wiederkehren, so there's a sense of turning at work. Time is not linear, and history is not linear. And that means they're not circular either. They are of a simultaneous counter-swinging, a recurring turning such that every moment rather, is not simply a homogeneous passing now state flowing from the future into the present and away into that which we call the past. Instead, each moment occurs as it recurs from that which has been, and that which has been at once always already tears open cracks in that which is to come, the future. From out of these cracks, the possibility for this moment is thrown open. When Nietzsche speaks of amor fati, he asks to love that which has been as the necessity for that which will be. Hence, Nietzsche in the Gay Science includes a paragraph entitled Incipit Tragödia right after the paragraph 342 on the eternal recurrence of the same. May tragedy begin anew. Only then can the last man be overcome. Only then can there be a new proper what for arise for humanity. The triumphant nihilist or atheist who simply denies the truth of that which has been is cut off from that history. The self-aggrandizing subject that wants to produce itself and eradicate all suffering, which also means to be created, thrown, rather than being the product of one's own whim, this subject denies the most profound truth of existence, that there is an unresolvable tension at the very heart of existence. Hence, those who deny tragedy also must deny beauty, and they become great destroyers, even bearers of the desert. It is heroic to accept tragedy, and taking a tragic stance means to bear the contradictions of existence. This, of course, reminds us of Nietzsche's dichotomy of the Dionysian and the Apollinian, the exuberant and the prudent, the thirst for annihilation in the strive for life and desire for life paired with the tempered and measured, the will to control and domesticate. One cannot be without the other. The Apollinian is only beautiful when the Dionysian is allowed its ways in its own right, but not on its own. The last man then is nihilistic and deeply so, for he sees himself as the absolute truth and goal of history, but at once also denies the suffering as having been necessary at arriving at this foul end stage of history, where nothing higher than securing production and consumption are in store for us. Yet, as Nietzsche says, in order to affirm, one needs to turn away to move beyond, while it is necessary to make mention of the problems of modernity and to diagnose what is, as it is the task of the philosopher, there comes the moment when one needs to turn away from one's time and its problems and sail towards new shores. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche warns of becoming ape-like. In a chapter entitled Vom Vorübergehen, the ape of Zarathustra gives himself meaning by continuously critiquing and ridiculing the city and its citizens as incapable of understanding the truth of our age. Zarathustra reminds his resentful copycat that, quote, where one can no longer love, one shall pass by, one shall move on. Vorübergehen in the German is the verb. In the verb vorübergehen, we hear the preposition über, meaning in this context over and beyond. The preposition über is also found in the word Übermensch. This is why Übermensch is now often translated as overman rather than superman. The overman is the one who goes over and beyond what is, turns away from mere critique, and has in sight a new dawn, which could only ever arise out of the darkness of the night. The Übermensch is the bridge, the one who can affirm the death of God not as a triumph, but as a most frightful tribulation, as the echo of history itself, and at the same time as a question that needs answering. This is why the madman and Zarathustra both realize that they come too early, that their teachings are untimely, for philosophy is always untimely, always beyond and behind its time. Why? For the very way that time and history work. This is what Nietzsche means when he calls himself a halcyonic thinker in the case of Wagner. The halcyon is the icebird, which breeds just at the right time in winter during a 7-day period, when the sea is at rest. That is to say, the halcyon already sees the dangers to come, but there is an awareness that those dangers also already will have happened. The sound and harmony of the halcyonic is the melody of the Übermensch. It is the solemn dance and lightness after hardship. Halcyonic thinking affirms the eternal recurrence of the same as the heaviest weight, as that which gives weight again to existence, precisely because history has not ended, and from the moon to a grain of dust, everything matters and recurs, insofar as history is not the succession of measurable events, but as Zarathustra says, it is the stillest words that bring on the storm, thoughts that come on dove's feet guide the world. It is through thinking, by thinking in such a manner, that history begins to show the possibility for meaning again. For only when there is necessity to that which occurs, even if what we are confronted with is nihilism, can one begin again to hear the distant melody of history, echoes of meaning, even or perhaps precisely when all meaning seems most absent. Thank you very much for listening. Subscribe to my channel and please leave a comment. Thank you.